I recall having an interview for a job in Manchester. I don't recall leaving the house. I do recall hiring a car from a nearby garage and pointing it north. There was the inevitable pub and a girl, noisy music, flashing lights, a bed, sleep, and finally nothing. I awoke feeling very strange. The sensation was totally unreal. The room was a bedroom I had never seen before, neatly furnished and decorated in many colours, but each colour was peculiarly vivid. It was just impossible to describe. I tried to sit up. It was then I realised that I was tied by wrists and ankles to the four corners of the bed. A cold sweat broke out all over me, and a feeling of indescribable fear gripped and paralysed my every nerve. Suddenly, the only door in the room opened and the girl from the night before stood waiting. Behind her, head and shoulders taller, stood the biggest, ugliest man I had ever seen in my life. The girl was laughing, but the man leered with an expression more horrifically evil than the normal mind could imagine. The girl, still laughing, advanced towards the bed. Her voice sounded as if it was amplified by an echo chamber. The man came closer too and spoke for the first time. Stark terror, coupled with echo waves, rebounded off the walls. I couldn't make out all the words, but the message was clear. She was his wife. My head was in turmoil. Had he caught me in bed with her? Had she set me up for some insane or perverted game? My mind was crowded with terrifying thoughts. Then I saw the knife. The blade was all of 12 inches long and reflected the blues, greens, reds and yellows of the room in flashes of a distorted colour. A forward thrust with deadly speed, and the knife penetrated my foot. My teeth sank into my tongue, and blood mixed with vomit as I strained against the ropes that held me. The pain was excruciating as my tormentor twisted the blade, grinding it against the bones in my foot. I prayed for unconsciousness to take over. It did not. Somehow I retained my faculties, but there was further agony as the cold steel of the weapon was torn from the wicked wound it had created. What had been my right foot was now a soggy mess of raw meat. My head was filled with terrifying sounds, similar to an orchestra playing discords to heighten the tension in a horror movie. My tormentor was shouting and screaming obscenities, and I knew the worst was yet to come. Why, oh why, could I not pass out? Please God, let me die now. I was pleading for an end to my ordeal in sobbing, anguished cries, begging for a merciful release. Then he produced a saw. It was an ordinary carpenter's tool, about 2.5 feet in length, with sharp teeth. As it made its first brutal tearing incision just below my knee, I realized he was going to amputate my leg. Now I knew that I was going insane, driven by the pain and the effects of my ordeal. I was blabbering and crying like a demented child. Blood spurted from me with such force that it sprayed the room. The thrusts of the saw severed flesh and bone with defiant ruthlessness. I heard a sickening thud as my severed limb hit the floor. The whole of my body was one searing mass of pain, and I felt my clenched teeth breaking under the terrible pressure to which they were being subjected as my tormentor continued his surgery on my other leg. Suddenly and incredibly, it was over. He was gone, and there was no sign of the girl. My arms were free, and I was lying on the floor, writhing in agony. Seeing my chance of escape, I struggled to the door on my bleeding stumps. Then I fell down a carpeted stairway, but somehow managed to get through the door into the warm morning air. I crawled, screaming for help, with my raw limbs dragging on the concrete pathway which led to a busy street. I was now surrounded by people and recognized the blue uniform of a policeman. It was then that my earlier prayers were answered and I lapsed into deep unconsciousness. Can you tell me something about yourself, young man? My eyes were out of focus, but I could make out a white-clad figure beside my bed. I moved my aching body a few inches and rubbed my eyes in an attempt to obtain a little clarity. I could identify some of the surroundings now. It was obviously a hospital ward, and my companion was a doctor. You had nothing on your person to identify you when you were admitted. The voice seemed more real than before, and I gazed in its direction. Nothing? My voice was shaky and sounded unfamiliar. Only a motor car ignition key. The white figure had become a man of about 40 in a surgical coat. My name's Nick Charles. Will I be fitted with wooden legs? The doctor completely failed to conceal his look of amazement. Excuse me, I'll be back in a moment, he said, and walked out of the ward. When he returned, he was accompanied by a colleague. I'm Dr. King, he said, introducing himself. And this is Dr. Ross, who would like to talk to you. Ross was a small, dapper man, about 50 years of age, and thinning on top. Hello, Nick. Would you like to tell me what has been happening to you? Both men gazed down expectantly in my direction. My eyes scanned the ward. It was a normal-sized room by hospital standards, but somehow different, and I couldn't quite decide what was wrong. I was at the one end of the ward and, apart from 3 patients at the other, all the beds were empty. My eyes focused back on the doctors. I would have thought that was obvious, was my reply. Well, not altogether, answered Ross, firmly but gently. Could you tell us from the beginning, if you feel well enough? He had a point. I felt lousy. My head was splitting and God knows I needed a drink. I was getting withdrawal pains from the booze, or rather lack of it, and I ached everywhere. I considered my situation. The police would be next on the scene and they would want to know everything. I decided that the doctors deserved an explanation. As best I could remember, I repeated my experiences. Certain parts made me wince, and towards the end I felt ill reliving them. When I'd finished, there was a short silence, and then Dr. Ross said, "Would you like to sit up?" My reaction was one of amazement, so he came over to my bed and turned back the bedclothes. I looked incredulously at the human form that was my body stretching out before me. It was all there, untouched, undamaged, and totally functional. My mind was in turmoil. How? Why? I broke down and wept uncontrollably. I was immediately sedated. I felt the needle. Peace and tranquility followed, and I floated into a deep sleep. It was some days before I learned the whole truth. I was in a psychiatric hospital, and Dr. Ross explained fully about his suspicions that I was an alcoholic. Your body showed signs of an enormous alcohol presence, and I'm quite sure that you had been abusing alcohol dramatically without food for a long period. The high alcohol blood level on an empty stomach meant you endured similar to a drug-induced trip. You mean all of that was an alcohol hallucination? I kind of stammered. A very, very bad one, said Ross, sympathetically. I lay back on the bed, exhausted. It was all those bombers in the war, my lad. One of them shook up your brains for sure. My mother's words repeated themselves again and again, like a stylus struggling to overcome an obstruction in the groove of an aging record. Her voice was so clear that I could have been back in my old bedroom at home years before. Mother would yell up the stairs for me to get out of bed while I struggled under the bedclothes with the awful withdrawal symptoms from alcohol. I was only a teenager, but I simply didn't understand what was happening to me, and there was no one else around who did either. Sweating now as I had then, I doubted the voice that was telling me that my ordeal had been a bad hallucination. Despite sedation, I spent a sleepless night and was always checking that my legs were still there, because I was completely unsure of what constituted reality. I was aware that there was a thin line between insanity and normality. I thought of it as the silky thread of a spider, and for me, the thread seemed broken. Only as the effects of the alcohol wore off would I begin to cope with the truth that I still had legs, and learn to live with the ghost amputation pains that seemed so real and would remain to haunt me forever. An alcoholic drink would never taste quite the same, ever again.